The Mafia boss had ruled the city for decades, feared, obeyed, unstoppable. But there was one secret no one dared mention. He was born deaf. No music, no laughter, no last words from the people he lost. Silence was the price he paid for power. That morning, he sat alone in his study as his new maid tidied the room. She was quiet, careful, invisible, just the way he preferred, until she froze. Her eyes locked onto his ear. She stepped closer, hands trembling. Then she whispered something he couldn't hear but could feel. With a gentle motion, she reached toward him and pulled out something small, something hidden, something no doctor had ever noticed. The Mafia boss stiffened. A sharp rush flooded his head, and then for the first time in his life, he heard a sound. His own breath, the room, the world. The silence shattered, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city realized the greatest miracle of his life had just come from the one person he never truly saw. Stay with me until the end, because what he hears next will change everything he believes about his past. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. Vincent Torino controlled everything. Every street corner, every business deal, every whispered conversation that mattered in this city belonged to him. Men twice his size trembled when his shadow fell across their path. Police commissioners took his phone calls at 3 in the morning. Judges rewrote verdicts with a single glance from his cold, gray eyes. For 37 years, he had built an empire on fear, respect, and absolute silence. But Vincent's silence ran deeper than anyone imagined. While his enemies assumed his quietness came from calculated intimidation, the truth was far more personal. Vincent Torino had never heard a single word spoken in anger, never caught the nervous stutter in a traitor's voice, never experienced the satisfaction of hearing his enemies beg for mercy. He read lips with deadly precision. He felt vibrations through floorboards and furniture. He understood the language of fear written across faces better than most people understood their native tongue. The Torino mansion sat like a fortress on the hill overlooking the harbor. 32 rooms of polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and artwork stolen from museums across 3 continents. Security cameras tracked every movement. Armed guards patrolled every entrance. And somewhere within those walls, Vincent lived in a world of absolute quiet, managing his criminal empire through careful observation and ruthless intelligence. His office occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that belonged to him. The mahogany desk had witnessed handshake deals worth millions and signatures that sealed the fate of anyone foolish enough to cross the Torino family. Behind that desk sat Vincent, always dressed in perfectly tailored suits, always watching, always calculating his next move. The household staff moved through the mansion like ghosts. They understood the rules without being told. No sudden movements, no unnecessary noise, no direct eye contact unless absolutely required. Vincent preferred his environment controlled, predictable, manageable. Chaos belonged on the streets he controlled, not within the walls of his sanctuary. That Tuesday morning started like every other. Vincent reviewed financial reports from his various operations while sipping espresso from bone china. The numbers told their familiar story of profit and power. The docks generated steady income from shipping containers that never saw customs inspection. The construction contracts provided perfect opportunities for money laundering. The casino revenues flowed like a golden river directly into offshore accounts. Maria Santos arrived at 7:30 sharp for her first day of employment. She carried herself differently than the previous housekeeping staff. Where others moved with nervous energy, she walked with quiet confidence. Her references had checked out perfectly. Previous employers praised her attention to detail, her discretion, her ability to work efficiently without supervision. More importantly, she came from the old neighborhood where people understood the value of keeping their mouths shut. Mrs. Benedetti, the head housekeeper, led Maria through the mansion's corridors. The older woman's instructions were precise and non-negotiable. Start in the guest quarters. Work your way through the formal dining areas. Save the master's study for last, and only when he signals permission. Never interrupt. Never ask questions. Never assume anything. Maria nodded at each instruction, absorbing the weight of expectation that hung over the household. She had worked for wealthy families before, but nothing quite like this. The mansion felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves held secrets that demanded respect. Vincent noticed her immediately when she entered his study that afternoon. Not because she was beautiful, though she carried herself with an elegance that commanded attention. Not because she seemed nervous, though he detected the slight tension in her shoulders as she began dusting the antique furniture. He noticed her because she moved with purpose. Each gesture was deliberate, efficient, respectful of the space she occupied. She worked systematically around the room. The bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes he had never read, but kept for appearances. The crystal decanters containing whiskey, older than most of his enemies. The collection of ivory chess pieces arranged on a board, where no game had been played in 20 years. Vincent watched her from his peripheral vision, noting how she handled each item with appropriate care. Maria approached the area near his desk to dust the window ledge. Vincent continued reading his reports, maintaining the illusion of disinterest while keeping her within his sight. She worked quietly, respectfully, exactly as he preferred. But then something changed. Her movements slowed. She paused mid-motion, cloth suspended in her hand. Vincent looked up to find her staring directly at him with an expression he couldn't immediately interpret. Not fear, not curiosity, something else entirely. Something that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar tension. She took a step closer, then another. Her eyes remained fixed on the right side of his head, with an intensity that made Vincent's jaw clench. No one stared at him like this. No one dared examine him as if he were a puzzle requiring solution. His hand moved instinctively toward the desk drawer where he kept his pistol. But Maria's expression wasn't threatening. It was concerned, almost maternal. She raised her hand slowly, pointing toward his ear with a trembling finger. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear but somehow felt in the space between them. The air itself seemed to vibrate with whatever message she was trying to convey. Vincent's world operated on control. Every variable managed, every outcome predicted, every threat neutralized before it could materialize. But this moment existed outside his carefully constructed reality. This woman, this stranger, was seeing something that dozens of doctors, specialists, and medical experts had missed throughout his entire life. Maria's hand hovered inches from his ear. Vincent could feel the warmth radiating from her palm, could sense the careful deliberation in her movement. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to reassert control, to remind this woman exactly who she was dealing with. But something deeper held him frozen in place. Something he had never experienced before. Trust. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, not the cold, clinical touch of the medical professionals who had poked and prodded him throughout childhood. This was different, gentle, almost reverent, as if she understood that what she was about to do would change everything. Vincent felt a strange pressure in his ear canal, a sensation he had grown so accustomed to that it had become part of his normal existence, like a constant companion he had never questioned. Maria's brow furrowed in concentration as she worked, her breathing steady and focused. She was reaching for something that had been there for decades. The resistance was immediate. Whatever blocked his hearing had settled deep, becoming part of his anatomy through years of neglect. Maria paused, meeting his eyes with a look that asked permission to continue. Vincent found himself nodding, surrendering control to this woman he barely knew. The most dangerous man in the city placing his fate in the hands of his housekeeper. She adjusted her approach, angling differently, applying gentle but persistent pressure. Vincent felt movement inside his head, a shifting sensation that made his stomach clench with anticipation and terror. What if this changed nothing? What if he remained trapped in silence forever? What if this moment of hope became just another disappointment in a lifetime of medical failures? Then something gave way. A small, dark mass emerged from deep within his ear canal. Waxy, compacted, years of buildup that had slowly stolen his connection to the world. Maria held it in her palm, staring at the tiny object that had imprisoned Vincent's hearing for 37 years. Such a small thing to have such devastating consequences. The rush hit him like a physical blow. Air moving through passages that had been blocked since childhood. Pressure equalizing in ways his body had forgotten were possible. Vincent's hands flew to his head as sensation flooded his skull. His heart hammered against his ribs as his brain struggled to process completely foreign input. And then he heard it. The sound of his own breathing. Ragged, desperate gasps that he had never experienced as anything more than the feeling of air moving through his lungs. Now they had texture, rhythm, presence. The sound filled the room. Echoing off walls that had held silence for so long, they seemed surprised to carry noise. Vincent's eyes went wide with shock. His mouth opened, but no words came. How could there be words for something this impossible? His breathing grew louder, more frantic, as if he were drowning in sound after a lifetime underwater. Each inhale and exhale created a symphony he had never imagined possible. But that was only the beginning. The grandfather clock in the corner had been ticking for decades. Vincent had felt its vibrations through the floorboards, had used its mechanical rhythm to mark the passage of time during long meetings and longer nights of planning. Now that steady tick-tock crashed through his consciousness like thunder. Precise, relentless, beautiful. Time itself had found its voice. Maria took a step backward, her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound made Vincent flinch as if she had fired a gunshot. Such a simple noise, the contact between leather and stone, but to his newly awakened ears, it rang like church bells announcing a miracle. The city beyond his windows revealed itself in ways he had never imagined. Car horns in the distance, their angry voices carrying stories of traffic and frustration. Construction equipment rumbling like mechanical beasts several blocks away. The harbor foghorn calling out its lonely warning to ships navigating treacherous waters. An entire urban orchestra had been playing around him his whole life, and he was finally allowed to hear the music. Vincent stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The leather chair creaked as his weight shifted. Another sound he had never experienced, the rustle of his expensive suit fabric as he moved, the soft whisper of papers sliding across his desk as his movement disturbed them. Even his own heartbeat seemed to echo in the newfound acoustic landscape of his awareness. Maria watched him with tears streaming down her face. She understood what this moment meant. Not just the restoration of his hearing, but the resurrection of a part of his humanity that had been buried for decades. She had witnessed something that bordered on divine intervention, and the weight of that responsibility showed in her trembling hands. Vincent tried to speak, to thank her, to express what words could never capture, but his voice, unused to being heard by its own owner, came out as a broken whisper. The sound of his own vocal cords vibrating, creating words he could finally receive as well as send. It was too much, too overwhelming, too impossibly wonderful. He sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the sensory revolution taking place in his head. 37 years of silence had ended in a single moment of gentle intervention. This woman, this stranger who cleaned his floors and dusted his shelves, had accomplished what teams of specialists had declared impossible. But as the initial shock began to fade, Vincent realized something that chilled him to the bone. If Maria could see what doctors had missed, if she could fix what experts had declared unfixable, then everything he believed about his condition had been built on lies. Someone, somewhere, had failed him deliberately, and Vincent Torino did not tolerate failure. His newly awakened hearing would change everything. But first, he needed answers, and he would get them. no matter the cost. The questions started immediately. Vincent's mind, sharp from decades of calculating every angle, every threat, every opportunity, began dissecting what had just happened with surgical precision. How long had that blockage been there? Since birth? Since childhood? How many medical professionals had examined him throughout his life without noticing something so obvious? Dr. Morrison had been the family physician for 23 years, a respected ear specialist who charged premium rates for his expertise. He had examined Vincent's ears countless times, always concluding that the deafness was congenital, irreversible, something to accept rather than treat. Vincent remembered sitting in that sterile office as a 12-year-old, while Dr. Morrison explained to his father that some conditions simply couldn't be fixed, but Maria had fixed it in 30 seconds. Vincent's breathing grew sharper as anger began mixing with wonder. Each inhale now carried the sound of rage building in his chest. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, but now it sounded like a countdown to someone's reckoning. Because if Dr. Morrison had missed something this simple, this treatable, then either he was incompetent or he was complicit. In Vincent's world, both options carried the same consequence. Maria stood frozen near the window, clutching the small, waxy mass she had extracted. Her face showed concern mixed with growing fear as she watched Vincent's expression darken. She had worked for powerful families before, but none quite like this. The stories whispered in the old neighborhood painted Vincent Torino as someone who settled debts with permanent solutions, and she had just revealed that someone had been lying to him for decades. Vincent stood again, his movements more controlled now, despite the overwhelming sensory input flooding his consciousness. He walked to his desk and opened the top drawer, not for the pistol this time, but for his phone. The device felt different in his hands now that he could hear its subtle electronic hum, the barely audible vibration of its internal mechanisms. He dialed Dr. Morrison's private number, the one reserved for emergencies and family matters. As the phone rang, Vincent experienced something completely new, the actual sound of a telephone call. Each ring reverberated through the speaker, through his ear into his consciousness with crystal clarity. When the doctor's voice answered, Vincent nearly dropped the phone. A human voice, real, textured, carrying emotion and inflection that lip reading had never conveyed. Dr. Morrison sounded older than Vincent remembered, tired, perhaps a little nervous about receiving an unexpected call from his most dangerous patient. Vincent's own voice came out stronger this time, though still rough from the shock of hearing himself speak. He arranged an immediate appointment, not a request, a command delivered with the quiet authority that had made grown men weep. Dr. Morrison agreed without question, as he always did when the Torino family called. After ending the call, Vincent turned his attention back to Maria. She remained by the window, still holding the evidence of 3 decades of medical negligence. Her hands trembled slightly, and Vincent could hear that trembling now, the subtle rustle of fabric as her body shook with nervous energy. Even fear had a sound, and it was more complex than he had ever imagined. But beneath her fear, Vincent detected something else: compassion. The same maternal concern that had driven her to examine his ear in the first place. This woman had risked her job, possibly her safety, to help him. In a world where everyone wanted something from Vincent Torino, she had simply wanted to ease his suffering. Vincent approached her slowly, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor like gunshots. Each step announced his presence in ways that had been impossible before. Power had always been visual for him. The way people's faces changed when he entered a room, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence, the way even hardened criminals found excuses to look anywhere except directly at him. Now power had a soundtrack, the whisper of expensive fabric as he moved, the authoritative click of Italian leather against stone, the subtle creaking of floorboards responding to his weight. Even his breathing carried menace when amplified by newfound hearing. Vincent realized he had been performing his role as a crime boss, with only half the tools available to him. Maria finally looked up as he approached. Her eyes were wide, still processing the magnitude of what she had accidentally accomplished. Vincent stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, close enough that he could hear her heart beating faster with each passing second. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Vincent studied her face with new appreciation for the woman who had just changed his life forever. Maria was perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered beauty that spoke of hard work and harder choices. Her hands showed calluses from years of manual labor, but they had moved with the precision of a surgeon when she touched his ear. When Vincent finally spoke, his voice carried a gentleness that surprised them both. He thanked her. 2 simple words that carried the weight of a lifetime's gratitude. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she heard the emotion in his voice, the raw humanity that had been locked away behind decades of silence. But Vincent's gratitude came with complications. Maria had seen what doctors had missed. She had accomplished what specialists had declared impossible, which meant either every medical professional he had ever consulted was incompetent, or someone had been deliberately maintaining his deafness for their own purposes. The second possibility made Vincent's blood run cold. Who benefited from keeping Vincent Torino deaf? Who gained advantage from his disability? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, spreading through his consciousness and demanding answers. In his organization, information was power, and someone had been controlling his access to one of the most basic forms of human communication for his entire life. Vincent walked to his safe, hidden behind a false panel in the mahogany bookshelf. His fingers moved across the combination lock while his ears picked up the subtle mechanical clicks of each number falling into place. Another sound he had never experienced. Even his secrets had been kept in silence until now. Inside the safe, among stacks of cash and sensitive documents, Vincent kept detailed files on everyone in his organization, including medical records, payment histories, and personal information about Dr. Morrison. If the doctor had been deliberately negligent, the evidence would be somewhere in those carefully maintained records. But first, Vincent needed to understand the full scope of what had been stolen from him. He had lived 37 years believing his deafness was an unchangeable fact of life, a limitation that shaped every decision, every relationship, every moment of his existence. Now that limitation had been revealed as an illusion, a lie maintained by people he had trusted with his most vulnerable moments. The rage building in Vincent's chest had a sound now, the sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth, the grinding of molars as his jaw tightened with fury, the steady rhythm of his heart pumping blood through veins that carried decades of accumulated anger. Even his silence had been taken from him, replaced by the unavoidable soundtrack of his own emotional responses. Maria remained by the window, watching Vincent's face cycle through shock, gratitude, suspicion, and finally cold calculation. She had worked for enough powerful men to recognize the expression that was settling over his features. Someone was about to pay a very steep price for their deception. Vincent's phone rang again, and this time he was prepared for the sound. The caller ID showed his lieutenant, Marco, checking in with the day's reports. Vincent answered, and for the first time in his life, he heard the voice of his most trusted associate. Marco sounded exactly as Vincent had imagined, deep, gravelly, carrying the weight of too many cigarettes and too much whiskey. The captivate conversation was brief and professional. Marco reported on collections, territorial disputes, and routine business matters. But Vincent found himself distracted by the texture of human speech, the way emotion colored every syllable, the subtle cues that had been invisible to him throughout their 20-year partnership. After ending the call, Vincent realized something that made his stomach clench with new understanding. How many conversations had he misunderstood because he could only see lips, not hear tone? How many enemies had he failed to detect because he couldn't hear the nervousness in their voices? How many allies had he misjudged because he missed the sincerity in their words. His deafness had been more than a medical condition. It had been a strategic disadvantage that someone had deliberately maintained. And Vincent Torino did not tolerate disadvantages any more than he tolerated lies. The appointment with Dr. Morrison was scheduled for 6 o'clock that evening. Vincent spent the remaining hours experiencing his mansion with newly awakened senses. The house that had been his sanctuary of silence revealed itself as a symphony of subtle sounds. Water moving through pipes behind the walls, the hum of electrical systems powering his security network, the distant murmur of staff members going about their duties in other wings of the mansion. Each sound told a story Vincent had never been able to read before. The patterns of movement that revealed which servants were nervous, which were efficient, which were simply going through the motions of their employment. His world had suddenly become three-dimensional, in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. But as the afternoon faded toward evening, Vincent's focus narrowed to a single purpose. Someone had stolen 37 years of his life. Someone had profited from his disability. Someone had looked him in the eye and lied about his condition while collecting payment for their deception, and Vincent Torino always collected his debts with interest. Dr. Morrison's office sat in the most expensive medical building downtown. Vincent had been there dozens of times over the years, always leaving with the same verdict: permanent hearing loss, congenital defect, nothing to be done. Accept your condition and move forward. Tonight felt different as Vincent walked through those familiar hallways. His footsteps echoed off polished floors with a rhythm he had never experienced. The elevator hummed with mechanical precision as it carried him to the 15th floor. Even the fluorescent lights buzzed with electrical energy that painted the silence he had known his entire life. Dr. Morrison's receptionist looked up nervously as Vincent entered the waiting area. She had always been skittish around him, but tonight her fear had a soundtrack. The rapid clicking of her pen against the desk, the sharp intake of breath when their eyes met, the subtle rustle of papers as her hands trembled while pretending to organize files. Vincent took a seat in the leather chair facing the reception desk. The cushions exhaled softly under his weight, another sound that belonged to a world he was just discovering. Around him, the office hummed with activity he had never noticed. Air conditioning cycling on and off, computer fans whirring quietly, the distant murmur of voices from examination rooms where other patients discussed their medical concerns. 20 minutes later, Dr. Morrison emerged from his private office. The man looked exactly as Vincent remembered. Silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit tailored to hide a growing paunch, gold-rimmed glasses that reflected the overhead lighting. But now Vincent could hear the doctor's approach. The confident stride that had always seemed professional suddenly sounded hollow, artificial, like an actor playing a role he had rehearsed too many times. The handshake felt different, too. Vincent could hear the slight tremor in Dr. Morrison's breathing, the way his voice carried just a hint of nervousness, despite his practiced, bedside manner. They walked into the examination room together, and Vincent noticed how the doctor's shoes squeaked slightly against the floor. Such a small detail, but one that suggested discomfort beneath the polished exterior. Dr. Morrison gestured toward the examination chair with practiced authority. Vincent settled into the familiar position, while the doctor prepared his instruments. The otoscope clicked as it was assembled, the light buzzing to life with electronic precision. Vincent had undergone this examination countless times, but never with the ability to hear every mechanical detail of the process. The doctor approached with his usual professional confidence, but Vincent detected something new in his movements, a hesitation that hadn't been there during previous visits, as if Dr. Morrison sensed that tonight's examination might reveal more than either of them was prepared to handle. Vincent tilted his head to allow access to his right ear, the same ear that Maria had treated just hours earlier. Dr. Morrison positioned the otoscope and peered inside, his breathing steady but slightly faster than normal. Vincent could hear everything now. The doctor's quiet gasp of surprise, the sharp intake of breath that suggested discovery, the moment when professional composure cracked just enough to let truth slip through. Dr. Morrison stepped back from the examination chair, his face pale beneath the office lighting. His hands trembled as he set down the otoscope, the instrument clattering against the metal tray with more noise than necessary. For several long moments, silence filled the room. Not the comfortable silence Vincent had known his entire life, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that comes before devastating revelations. When Dr. Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried defeat. The blockage was gone, completely removed. After decades of examinations, the obstruction that had stolen Vincent's hearing had vanished as if it had never existed. The doctor's words came out in careful, measured tones, but Vincent could hear the underlying panic beneath each syllable. Vincent's expression remained neutral, but his newly awakened hearing caught every nuance of the doctor's distress. The way his voice cracked slightly on certain words, the increased pace of his breathing as stress flooded his system, the subtle shift in tone that suggested a man desperately trying to control a situation that had spiraled beyond his influence. The questions came next, delivered with the quiet intensity that had made Vincent Torino legendary in certain circles. How long had the blockage been visible during examinations? When had Dr. Morrison first noticed the obstruction? Why had removal never been attempted or even suggested as a treatment option? Dr. Morrison's answers came slowly, each word carefully chosen but ultimately inadequate. His high claimed the blockage had been difficult to detect, suggested that removal would have been risky without proper surgical facilities, insisted that the hearing loss had appeared to be nerve damage rather than mechanical obstruction. Vincent listened to these explanations with growing certainty that every word was a lie. His newly awakened hearing allowed him to detect the subtle vocal patterns that accompanied deception. The slight tremor that crept into the doctor's voice when he stretched the truth, the way his breathing became shallow during the most fabricated portions of his explanation. But it wasn't just the lies that Vincent could hear now, it was the fear. Dr. Morrison was terrified, and that terror had a very specific quality. This wasn't the general nervousness that came from treating a dangerous patient. This was the focused dread of someone whose carefully constructed deception had just collapsed around him. Vincent stood slowly from the examination chair, his movement generating sounds that seemed to echo with menace in the small room. His suit fabric whispered against itself as he straightened his jacket. His shoes clicked against the floor with measured precision. Even his breathing carried an ominous weight that made Dr. Morrison step backward toward the wall. The conversation that followed was brief but comprehensive. Vincent's voice remained calm, controlled, almost conversational in tone. But beneath that civilized surface lay the promise of consequences that made the doctor's face drain of all remaining color. Vincent asked about payment records, treatment histories, and consultation notes spanning the past 23 years. Dr. Morrison's responses became increasingly desperate as the scope of his deception became clear. The blocked ear canal had been visible during every examination since Vincent was 14 years old. The condition was not only treatable, but easily corrected with basic medical intervention. The continuing diagnosis of permanent hearing loss had been a deliberate misrepresentation maintained for over 2 decades. Vincent absorbed this information with the calculating precision that had built his criminal empire. Someone had paid Dr. Morrison to keep him deaf. Someone who benefited from Vincent's disability had been financing his medical deception for most of his adult life. The question was who, and the answer would determine how many people died before this matter was resolved. The doctor's confession came in broken segments, interrupted by tears and desperate pleas for mercy. Vincent listened to it all with newly awakened ears, hearing not just the words, but the complete emotional breakdown of a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. The truth was worse than Vincent had imagined. Sometimes the greatest revelations come from the most unexpected places. Vincent Torino discovered that power built on silence could be shattered by a single act of compassion. Maria didn't just restore his Hearing. She exposed decades of betrayal and gave him something more valuable than fear or control. She gave him truth. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, one woman simply wanted to help, and sometimes that changes everything.